Hello everyone, and welcome to this multi-part video series on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Now, today we will be going over the authorship of the Gospels and the early dating of the Gospels. Now, this series in and of itself is designed to ask questions such as, why should I trust the Bible if it was written by people? Or did the Bible evolve over time and actually looks nothing like it did in its original state? Are the Gospels trustworthy at all? So, I believe a good place to start, and the simplest place to start with the Gospels, is were they actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Now, in order of how they came out, we know that Mark was written by John Mark, who was a follower of Peter. Luke was written by Paul's beloved physician. And Matthew was written by the apostle, the tax collector. And John was written by the apostle John. Now, the Gospels themselves were technically written anonymously. So one might ask how we actually know who the authors of the Gospels actually are. So we know, I'm relying a lot on notes on this. We know that the Gospels were written by these people by historical accounts outside the Bible, by Papias in 125 AD and Irenaeus in about 180 AD. Now what Papias says, and this is a direct quote, what Papias says about Mark. The elder also said this, Mark being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered he wrote accurately, but not, however, in the order that these things were spoken or done by our Lord. For he neither heard the Lord, nor followed him. But afterwards, as I said, he was with Peter, who did not make a complete or ordered account of the Lord's logic, or logia, but constructed his teachings according to Crea. So Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single matters as he remembered them, for he gave special attention to one thing, of not passing by anything he heard, and not falsifying anything in these matters. Now Papias also spoke about the book of Matthew. Concerning Matthew, these things were said. Therefore Matthew set in order the logia in Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted them as he was able. So it was interpreted in the Hebrew dialect, and then it was interpreted as people were able to understand the Hebrew dialect from Matthew. A lot of these Gospels, in fact, pretty much all of them, were recorded in ancient Greek. But Matthew was originally put down in Hebrew, but the surviving copies we have of it, which are very early, we'll be talking about that, were written in the ancient Greek. Now, Irenaeus in 180 AD gives a more comprehensive and straightforward quote on the authorship of the Gospels, which is this: Matthew published his own Gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue when Peter and Paul were preaching the Gospels in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher, which, yes, is Paul. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. So, now that we established who wrote the Gospels, one might ask why it was only these four Gospels that were actually included in the Gospel, while others were left out. And Bruce M. Metzger talks about it like this: the canon is a list of authoritative books more than it is an authoritative list of books. These documents did not derive their authority from being selected. Each one was authoritative before anyone gathered them together. As for the pseudepigrapha, the proliferation of the Gospels, epistles, and apocalypses in the first few centuries after Jesus, including the Gospels of Nicodemus, Barnabas, Bartholomew, Andrew, the Epistle of Paul to the Laodiceans, the Apocalypse of Stephen, and others, They are fanciful and heretical, neither genuine nor valuable as a whole, and virtually no orthodox father or council consider them to be authoritative or deserving of inclusion in the New Testament. Sorry for stumbling. Basically what they're saying is that the Gospels were always going to be selected. The Gospels themselves were already being circulated through the early church right after Jesus died. So what was going on was they were chosen because they had agreement in the early church, because this is just what they happened to use, while the other ones tend to be more Gnostic texts, or texts written far after, claiming to be, say, like the Gospel of Thomas, but Thomas didn't actually write that gospel down, or the Gospel of Judas, but Judas obviously didn't write that gospel down. That one's a very, very Gnostic text. So the reason they were chosen was because they were always going to be chosen, because this is what the early church knew is true. They knew who wrote the Gospels. They knew, and a lot of them were actually witnesses to Jesus while these Gospels were circulating around. So the people who were actually listening to these preachings could have actually said, hey, I was there. That didn't happen that way. And these people were very protective of the literature that got out there. Even past them, Irenaeus has an entire book called Against Heresies, which are just speaking against all of the heretical material that came out, all legendary material, all stuff that wasn't actually connected to Jesus. These people cared so much that the only thing that got out was what they saw, because what these are, these anonymous gospels written by people we know, so they aren't anonymous anymore. These are eyewitness testimony from people who actually witnessed and was there for Jesus. Now you know I said, and Papaya said that John Mark wasn't actually, let's go back to that quote. Here we go. Relative to Mark, for he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterwards, as I said, he was with Peter, who did not make a complete or ordered account of the Lord's logia, but constructed his teachings according to Creia, concise, self-contained teaching. So Mark did nothing wrong in writing down these matters. Basically, for people like John Mark or Luke, they are people writing down the teachings of Jesus at the foot of the people who are actually there. So obviously we know that Peter was there. We know that Paul was at the end of it, but Paul left for a time to gather all the teachings to make sure everything he taught was correct. Based on what the early church was saying, he was unscrupulous. He spent about 2 or 3 years just learning what actually happened after he had that encounter with Jesus that ended up changing his life. So again, these things were very carefully documented. Any false doctrines were spoken against, and spoken against very quickly. And the actual preaching and the culture around the teaching in this time was that if someone did hear something wrong, they could simply say, hey, that's wrong, but this is what it actually is. So the people who were actually there served as correctives against false teachings, but also made sure that the teachings were being spoken correctly. And it was an acceptable, fine thing to do, that there was no argument. It was just an acceptable practice in that time to make sure that was passed down. We're coming from an oral tradition culture, which means that the history was passed down by word. And what people normally think about this is a game of telephone. One person says one thing, another person says the other, and another person says that, and eventually the message turns into something completely different. But remember, this isn't a game. This is something where the actual history is written down in people's minds. So what they do is they just keep repeating and keep repeating and keep studying, and they have those correctives and they have these safeguards to make sure that things aren't evolving as the oral tradition is passed on. And we're going from this oral tradition to a written tradition, which is so beautiful, because the Gospels came out at just the right time for the written tradition to come in, where they could actually put these down on papyrus scrolls, on minuscule, and on But I'll tell you more about that later because I don't have those notes in front of me. But I said I'd get into the early dating of the Gospels today. We'll save that for the next video. And then after we get into the early Gospels, we'll go into the multiplicity of documents, handwritten manuscripts, which is actually redundant because manuscript means that it's handwritten. We'll talk about the multiplicity of documents, how it compares to other written documents passed down in history, and why you should care that there's so much well documented manuscripts in the first place. So sorry if this is a bit choppy. I'm doing my best. I'm not used to this type of format, but I hope with the information I shared, it can benefit you. And I'll keep doing my best to make even the next video better than this one. So God bless, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.